So I'm just going to give a little bit of an overview of some of the legislative provisions in the Work Health and Safety Act 2012. And some of these clauses place specific obligations on the employer to consult with employees on health and safety issues. And this is in recognition of the fact that having worker input and participation in health and safety matters promotes greater awareness and understanding of the risks. Also more effective collaboration and cooperation in implementing solutions and controls, and ultimately it does assist in reducing workplace injuries. So the first important clause is 47, the duty to consult workers. So this clause basically says that the person conducting a business or undertaking, which is essentially the employer, so far as reasonably practicable, must consult with workers who carry out work for the business. And the important thing about this clause is it includes not only workers who are paid directly by the employer, as we would traditionally think of as a worker for the business, but the definition also includes contractors, subcontractors, volunteers, and other unpaid workers. So it's anyone who carries out work for the business and who are or are likely to be affected by a matter involving health and safety. And there are some pretty strict penalties which can apply for failure to consult with your workers on that. Depending on the size and the nature of the business, there may be different local procedures for how this consultation looks and how it takes place. So for example, depending on the size of your business, you may have different levels of health and safety committee that you go through. But no matter what, the minimum standards set by Clause 48 must apply. So Clause 48 is that consultation must be genuine. Employers cannot simply advise what will be done or inform workers of decisions after the fact. Workers must be given sufficient information to be able to contribute to decisions, reasonable opportunity to express their views and contribute to the decision-making process, and their views must be genuinely taken into account, and they must be advised of outcomes of the consultation in a timely manner. And I'm sure many of you would be health and safety reps or would have health and safety reps at your workplace, and if you do, the consultation must involve that health and safety rep. So this is particularly important in times when it's not practicable or reasonable for the employer to consult with every single worker individually. So it's really important that you as your health and safety rep are really across what's happening in your work site so that you can make sure that this process gets good outcomes. Consultation is required whenever identifying hazards and assessing risks to health and safety, when making decisions about the ways to eliminate or minimize those risks, when making decisions about the adequacy of facilities for the welfare of workers, and when proposing changes that may affect the health and safety of workers, and also when making decisions about procedures for consulting with workers, resolving health and safety issues, monitoring the health of workers, and providing information and training. How long the consultation process takes and to what extent will vary depending on the context. So what is reasonably practicable in any situation will depend on variables such as the nature of the decision or action, the likelihood and severity of the risk, and the size, structure, and nature of the workplace and the work carried out. But whatever the circumstance, the aim of consultation should be to make sure that there's been sufficient communication and information sharing with employees to make well-informed decisions about health and safety matters, and that the workers who may be affected have had a genuine opportunity to provide their views and understand the reasons for any decisions that have been made. Another important document, particularly for many public sector workers, is the South Australian Public Sector Wages Parity Enterprise Agreement, and there are specific consultative processes embedded in that document, which apply to a range of workplace changes, including health and safety. And Greg will speak a bit more about that.
Okay, thanks very much, Tash, and good afternoon, everyone. Now, formalised legislative and industrial instrument provisions are only a fairly recent vintage, so in the short time available, plotted history. Since the 1960s and 1970s, there became a growing acceptance of the theory of industrial democracy as it applied to what was then called worker participation in management and to the concept of joint consultative committee arrangements. During that period, trade unions and their members turned their attention to the issue of job security in particular, arising out of the spate of redundancies that emerged in various private sector industries, often without any forewarning whatsoever. So for our purposes, by way of test cases in the South Australian Industrial Commission and the Australian Industrial Commission in the late 1970s, provisions relating to termination, change, including technological change, and redundancy were inserted in state and federal awards for the first time. I think it's fair also to say that in those times, industrial relations and human resource management were fairly new professions. Practitioners in these fields became more influential in managerial structures and more attuned to workplace dynamics. So moving forward to the 1980s and 1990s and the onset of enterprise bargaining, to a much fuller extent than hitherto, consultative provisions became the focus of much greater attention and often were achieved in those agreements after significant industrial disputation. So why should employees and unions have a say in matters that were once regarded as strictly within the realms of managerial prerogative, and what good public purpose is served? In the Queensland Rail case, referred to in Public Service Association versus the State of South Australia, the majority said that it was seen to give a real opportunity for employees to make suggestions that might be considered before the processes of bargaining begin. And put more comprehensively by Justice Gray, he said it was a genuine opportunity for employees to put these points of view and state their objections where necessary. And very tellingly, I think, he said, management has no monopoly of knowledge and understanding of how a business operates, or the wisdom to make the right decisions about it. He stated, the process of consultation is designed to assist management by giving it access to ideas from employees as well as to assist employees to point out aspects of a proposal that will produce negative consequences and suggest ways to eliminate or alleviate these consequences. Now, the consultation provisions in the Queensland Rail Enterprise Bargaining Agreement and in the South Australian Public Sector Enterprise Bargaining Agreement referred to by Tash a moment ago, both contain the wording that requires consultation to commence before a definite decision is made to introduce change. And it is common in enterprise agreements covering public sector generally, local government sector, and larger private sector employers for this to be the case, but not, I would say, in all enterprise agreements by any means. There are other examples that I could give you, but they are all around the same themes, and they are the bargaining or discussion has to be in good faith, that there will be genuine consideration or reconsideration of matters raised by employees and their unions before a definite decision is made. However, awards generally provide a safety net approach, and the important difference being that consultation is not required to commence until the employer has made a definite decision to introduce major changes that are likely to have significant effects on employees. And there's a typical set of wording from a major federal modern award. And you can see there's a huge difference here. The ability for employees and unions to influence the situation once a definite decision has been made has got to be far less than if you get the opportunity to come in from the get-go. Now, the wording of these clauses are important and not only to be observed for the sake of appearance. In the event of a dispute occurring between employees, their union and an employer, the industrial court, and I'm talking about the state industrial court, as in section 15 of the State Fair Work Act, has the jurisdiction to order a person who contravenes or fails to comply with the provision of this act, an award or an enterprise agreement, to take such steps to remedy that contravention or non-compliance. Further, in section 224 of the same act, if a person who is bound by an award or enterprise agreement contravenes or fails to comply with the provision of the award or agreement, the person is guilty of an offence. Now, leaving aside the paltry maximum penalty currently applies there, and you might like to contrast it with the Commonwealth Fair Work Act, where the penalty is $33,000 for each count, plus costs. Nonetheless, it is there as a salutary reminder that award and enterprise agreements are not to be tampered with and are to be obeyed. So, the principles have been confirmed as to how these matters are decided in a number of cases by the Industrial Court, and the most recent one is the PSA versus the State of South Australia Department of Health case, with the reference that you saw on an earlier slide. So in summary, whilst an employer may say that it has been abiding by an enterprise agreement it has made, which requires it to, for example, consult in good faith, not simply advise what will be done, there is a provision there for that to be challenged and determined by the Industrial Court. Thank you.
Thanks. So if I just highlight a couple of points there. So when Tash started with the consultative provisions in relation to work health and safety, we would have a mix in this room of public sector employees and those in private enterprise. Sorry, Steven Spielberg's directing. So the consultative provisions in relation to work health and safety apply to all of us, whether we're in private enterprise or within government. But as Greg pointed out, the consultative provisions that we have, via the PSA, via our enterprise bargaining agreement, are far superior to those in the private sector. Obviously, we want to cherish and hang on to those in a big way. But if I may start now with the question time, if I could just pose the first question to Greg, as I would do. Working in government, obviously we're at the mercy within reason of whoever's in political power at the time. So if there's a change of government, and a new government comes into power and says, well, we're now going to abolish 5,000 positions, how do the consultative provisions stack up when that happens?
Well, you did forewarn me that I might be asked this question, and that's obviously the most difficult one to deal with in the public sector. I can only answer it by saying that notwithstanding that there may be a political commitment to give the example that you gave, reduce a significant number of positions, nonetheless, the form of the process to consult in relation to that decision before it is finally made and acted upon has to be followed through. It was the very position, as in the Queensland Rail case, where the employer had already made a decision to implement a proposal prior to entering into any consultation. That was what the Queensland Rail case was all about. They had not consulted before attempting to implement the proposal to privatise part of Queensland Rail. And they were found to have breached the terms of the enterprise agreement.
Just open for any general questions, please.
So in that case, what was the penalty like with that 33,000?
Oh, there were significant penalties in this case.
Yeah.
Because although I believe that counsel for the employers argued that it wouldn't have made any difference what the employees had said, that was not found to be a valid argument. And so Queensland Rail were subject to a whole range of heavy penalties and costs made against it by the union that brought the case. However, what happened after that, I don't know. I understand the privatisation proposal did proceed, and it became a huge and hot political topic. I guess it was brought more to public gaze, and it reacted very badly against the government at the time of the next election, that they did it the way that they did it, particularly as it affected a lot of people in country and regional towns in Queensland.
No.
In the example that Nev just raised, would that be one decision, one count of a breach, and therefore one fine of $2,500?
I would like to think the PSA had lawyers that were able to find more than one count. But ostensibly that could well be, or there might be ways of breaking it down into separate breaches. For example, every day that the breach had occurred or persisted might be seen to be a separate count. Not ever having been a member of the Industrial Court as opposed to the Industrial Commission, I can't give you a definite answer on that one.
Do you have any guidance on what constitutes consultation and what constitutes in good faith, as in what is and what isn't?
Mm-hmm. Okay, that's a good question, and some enterprise agreement provisions do attempt to answer that. I'm looking at the University of South Australia consultative provision in their enterprise agreement, and they say that consultation is providing an individual or other relevant persons with a bona fide opportunity to influence the decision maker. Consultation is not perfunctory advice on what is about to happen, but also consultation is not joint decision making or even a negative or frustrating barrier to the prerogative of management to make decisions. Now, I suppose consultation in good faith or consultation in bad faith is in the eye of the beholder, very much, and it will come down to a matter of judgment in the end. By an independent arbitral body as to whether the consultation process, if it was carried out at all, was carried out in good faith. That is, an open and transparent process with nothing hidden other than commercial incompetence, and that there appeared to be genuine consideration or reconsideration of proposals advanced by employees or their unions. At the end of the day, it will come down to the individual case context.
Have there been any instances or cases where that very thing in faith is being questioned?
Oh, yes.
If employees feel that something that's not in good faith and it's just a little bit of like lip service, have there been any cases?
Yes, I can't recall one offhand. There have been cases. I should have brought with me Section 76 of the State Fair Work Act. You might like to look that up because it contains a series of points that need to be abided by in the bargaining process. And I would say that if push came to shove, they would be the main points the court would look at to see if each and every one of those had been met.
But there have been cases where that's been challenged or questioned?
Yes, I understand so, yes. And if I can locate a couple, I'll see that they're provided.
Well, that'd be helpful.
Sure.
Look, if you're wondering how it transpires from the PSA's perspective, we would represent around 32,000 people within the public sector. So the wider public sector is, let's say, around 85,000 people. The areas that we cover would be around 32,000 people. In terms of how we consult and vice versa with government, based on the size and complexity of the organisations that we deal with, I could quite legitimately probably go out and hire another 200 industrial officers tomorrow just to deal with issues of consultation. It can be so large. So, for example, Gypsy recent Department of Trade and Infrastructure, their most recent restructure, affecting thousands of people, and within that restructure, there would be meetings going on every day of every week around the various branches within that one organisation about what change was going to be implemented, etc. So it's on a huge scale, and to actually catch a tiger by the tail in those circumstances is actually quite difficult, which is why we rely on our network of PSA website reps to come to us and say, look, these are particular issues that the government's not consulting on. What we would then do is we would go through either official or unofficial channels. Now, the unofficial channels may be going through the minister for that particular area and saying, look, before this gets bigger than Ben Hur, we need to discuss some particular issues. This just isn't working or whatever, and then get some pushback on the CEO or the other people involved in that restructure. So there's various ways to deal with these particular, what we would see as being breaches of consultation. But I think it's important to realise how complex it can become. Now, if in the end we need to go to the Industrial Relations Commission, what would normally happen is that there would be an in-chambers meeting beforehand with one of the commissioners who would give advice to both parties and say, look, it's a closed room situation. The commission would say, look, what's your beef to both parties? We put forward a case, and the commission would say, look, I think you both need to go away and think about this, and this, and then come back. If you're still not happy, then we can formally lodge a dispute with the Industrial Relations Commission for a breach of consultation. The other area where it can become more involved too is remembering you've got the Public Sector Act provisions as well, and under Section 5 of the Public Sector Act, it states very clearly that all public sector workers must be treated fairly and equitably. So, aside from the consultative provisions contained in our EB, there are also areas within the award which we can then turn to. Because it actually becomes a multi-layer of argument as to around why the department has done a particular action and what impact that has had on our members. Now, aside from the Section 5 about treating all public sector workers fairly and equitably, there is another provision thereafter, of course, which relates to people being able to lodge an administrative grievance in relation to how they've been treated in the workplace. So they may have been involved in a restructure, they find themselves becoming redeployees or whatever the situation is. They then have a legitimate grievance, and they can lodge that grievance, and that grievance can be heard firstly through an internal grievance panel, followed by an external grievance panel, which is independent of government. And the external grievance panel can make recommendations back to the particular authority about what should then take place. So I just want to emphasise that there's a multi-layer approach that we would take depending upon the circumstances, where a member may come to us and say, look, this isn't fair, they haven't consulted, etc. The other thing, I suppose that Greg may want to comment on, but going back in time, our system is based on the Westminster system, and by that I mean it's really important to get frank and fearless advice from those people on the ground actually doing the work when you want to hold a restructure, because, and it happens in the PSA, I might have a whole range of bright ideas about how I'm going to employ people or how I'm going to change the PSA. But if you don't actually hear from the workers and put forward to them your suggestions, you can find yourself getting completely out of kilter and right up the creek. So the Westminster system comes back to that old adage of being able to provide frank and fearless advice, which of course is one of our areas of concern, because the more churn we see in people being on contracts, short-term or long-term, rather than being put into ongoing positions, the less we would argue they are inclined to provide that frank and fearless advice. So come restructure time, if you're not getting that legitimate advice from the coalface, then things can go belly up very quickly. So I just wanted to raise those particular points about the importance of that Westminster system, frank and fearless advice, and how that actually links in with provisions of consultation.
Just to add that, obviously, a union like the PSA cannot have eyes everywhere, in every agency at every point in time. And so where there's a change or a restructure in the wind, when I was in the commission and a dispute was notified by a union in relation to a change or restructure, I always asked the union to make sure they brought their job representatives along from that particular workplace with them, because I would then regard as being very important, not only what the union had to say itself, but about what the people who were on the job were saying or had been attempting to say at the workplace, and to take that into account in any advice that I gave.
Any other questions? Okay, and we're happy to stay behind if anybody wants to approach us. Thank you very much. We appreciate your attention.
Thank you.